What if the very people trusted to protect you turned out to be the monsters you feared? Imagine living in a town where the flashing lights of a police car didn't bring relief but terror, where justice only existed for the few who held power. To the cops, she was just another woman, powerless, voiceless, and invisible. But they didn't know who she really was. And when karma strikes, it doesn't miss. Sit tight, get comfortable, and let me tell you a chilling story of betrayal, power, and karma. Nina Martins was the kind of woman people admired quietly. She was graceful, calm, and warm, a presence that made you feel at ease. She spent her days teaching children, filling her classroom with hope and patience. Her students loved her, and the parents trusted her. At home, Nina found peace in the simple things, the smell of soil as she worked in her garden, the sound of her husband's footsteps when he returned from work, the little corner of her kitchen where her favorite teapot sat. To the world, she was Eric Martin's wife, but to those who truly knew her, she was so much more, a kind-hearted woman with quiet strength. Her husband, Eric Martins, wasn't just any man. As the police commissioner of Greenridge, he was respected across the town. Eric carried his authority well, a man who believed deeply in justice and fairness. But in a place like Greenridge, where corruption was as thick as the fog on rainy nights, even the commissioner's trust could be misplaced. It was a town where people whispered secrets they were too afraid to say aloud, the kind of town where the line between protector and predator was easy to blur. Some officers were different. Some officers felt untouchable, and they would soon show just how dangerous that feeling could be. The night it happened, the weather seemed to foreshadow the tragedy to come. It was a cold, gray Tuesday. The rain had started late in the afternoon, soft at first, then heavier as night fell. By 8 p.m., most streets in Greenridge were empty. Streetlights cast pale halos of light, but the mist swallowed everything. Nina had stayed late at school to tutor one of her students. She never minded staying late. Her students' progress always made it worthwhile. When she finally packed up her things and left the school, the halls were silent, her footsteps the only sound. Outside, the rain pattered on her coat as she hurried to her car, holding a stack of graded papers under her arm. The drive home was always peaceful. Nina enjoyed the back roads. The route passed through quiet fields and little farmhouses where the lights were already turned off. On rainy nights like this, everything looked different, darker, lonelier. But Nina wasn't afraid. She had driven this route hundreds of times. Her car hummed steadily, and the windshield wipers beat back and forth against the glass. Her thoughts drifted as they often did. Her husband would probably already be home, sitting at the table waiting for her. She imagined the steam rising from the cup of tea he'd make her when she walked through the door. But that night, the road didn't feel the same. The rain was louder. The mist seemed thicker. Nina tightened her hands on the wheel, squinting into the distance. And then she saw it, flashing blue and red lights in her rearview mirror. Her first instinct wasn't fear. Why would it be? She was the wife of the police commissioner, after all. A traffic stop wasn't unusual. She glanced down at the speedometer. She wasn't speeding. Maybe it was just a routine check. Nina slowed her car and pulled over to the side of the road, the gravel crunching beneath her tires. The flashing lights behind her reflected off her mirrors, filling the car with an unsettling blue glow. The rain beat harder on the roof of the car as she reached for her license and registration, trying to steady her breath. The sound of boots on gravel reached her ears, and then a beam of light cut through the window. It was harsh and blinding. Nina raised a hand to shield her eyes, blinking as the shadow of a man appeared just beyond the glass. He knocked once, hard, on the window. License and registration. Nina didn't recognize the voice, but that didn't mean much. Eric worked with dozens of officers, and she didn't know all their faces. She rolled the window down just enough to slip the documents through and handed them over. Her voice was polite, though there was a slight tremor in it. "I wasn't speeding, officer. Did I do something wrong?" There was no answer, only silence, save for the rain and the sound of her car engine idling. The officer stepped back, just far enough that Nina couldn't see his face clearly through the rain and mist. Something felt wrong. She could feel it in her chest, in the way the air seemed heavier. Then she saw movement out of the corner of her eye, another shadow approaching the passenger side. 2 officers. The second man tapped on the window, that harder this time. Nina's stomach twisted. "Step out of the car," the first officer said again, his voice low and firm. Nina's heart began to pound. "Is something wrong?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'd prefer to stay in the car." "Step out of the car now," he repeated, louder this time. The edge in his tone was sharp, the kind of sharp that doesn't leave room for questions. The second officer tapped harder, his knuckles rapping against the glass in quick, impatient bursts. Nina froze. This wasn't normal. She knew it now. Deep down, she knew this wasn't about a traffic stop. Her breath hitched as she sat there, trapped between them, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. For the first time that night, Nina felt real fear. Nina sat in her car, the air thick with tension. The rain outside grew heavier, a steady rhythm against the windshield, but all she could hear was her own breathing, shaky and shallow. The flashlight beam remained fixed on her face, as though they were deliberately trying to unsettle her. The first officer stepped closer, his silhouette towering outside the window. His voice was sharp, cutting through the rain like a knife. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am. You were speeding." Speeding? Nina knew she hadn't been. She hadn't even pressed the gas hard enough to go over the limit. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she gripped the wheel a little tighter. "I wasn't speeding," she said, her voice even but soft. "What's the issue?" For a moment, there was no reply. The first officer turned his head slightly, as if exchanging a glance with the second man who now stood at the passenger window. The second officer smiled, or maybe it was more of a smirk, the kind that carried no warmth. "Don't make this difficult," he said, his tone almost mocking. "Just cooperate." Cooperate. The word sent a chill down Nina's spine. Something was off. She knew how police stops worked. Eric had explained it to her before. But this wasn't normal. The first officer stepped back just slightly, motioning for her to open the door. "Ma'am, don't make us repeat ourselves. Step out of the car." Nina hesitated, her pulse quickening. Her mind raced. Could she refuse? Could she drive away? Her eyes darted to the rearview mirror. Their cruiser was still there, its lights spinning but no siren sounding. The mist was so thick, no one would see what was happening out here. "Why do I need to step out?" Nina asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though it shook just a little. "I'm not comfortable. Can I at least call my husband?" The mention of her husband was deliberate. She hoped it would remind them who she was, who Eric Martins was. Maybe that would make them stop. But it didn't. If anything, the officers exchanged another glance, their smirks widening like this was some unspoken joke between them. "You can make your calls later," the second officer said, his voice harder now. "Step out of the car." Nina's hands trembled as she reached for the door handle. Her instincts screamed at her to stay inside, to lock the doors and drive. But what could she do? They were police officers. To disobey them felt unthinkable. As she slowly pushed the door open and stepped out into the rain, the cold air hit her like a slap. The officers stood on either side of her now, their boots crunching against the gravel as they moved closer. She pulled her coat tighter around herself, her heart pounding in her ears. "Look, I don't understand," Nina said, her voice cracking slightly. "Can you just tell me what's going on?" The first officer stepped forward, close enough now that she could see his face. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp features and cold eyes that held no kindness. He stared at her for a moment, then said, "Turn around, hands on the car." "What?" "You heard me. Hands on the car," he repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Nina froze. Her body refused to move. She stared at him, trying to understand what was happening, why this was happening. "I didn't do anything wrong," she whispered. "Why are you doing this?" "Stop talking," the second officer snapped from behind her. "Just do as you're told." The first officer grabbed her by the arm, not roughly but firmly enough to make her flinch. The cold rain continued to pour, soaking her clothes, her hair dripping into her eyes. She couldn't see clearly anymore, couldn't think. They were yelling now, their voices louder, harsher. Her pleas were drowned out by the sound of the rain and their orders. Before she knew it, she was turned around, her palms pressed against the wet, cold surface of her car. Fear coursed through her veins like poison. This wasn't right. This wasn't normal. These men, they weren't acting like officers. And then she heard it. The sound of the second officer's voice, low, taunting. "You think you're special, don't you?" Her breath hitched. "Please, please stop." But they didn't. The world blurred after that. Their voices, the rain, the roughness of their hands, all of it blended into one nightmarish moment that seemed to stretch on forever. She screamed, but the mist and the rain swallowed her voice. There was no one to hear her, no one to stop them. When it was over, they left her there, alone, cold and broken. Her coat was soaked through, her hair plastered to her face. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. For a long time, she just lay there on the wet ground, staring up at the dark sky. The flashing lights of their cruiser disappeared into the mist, leaving only silence in their wake. Nina didn't know how long she lay there, shivering, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't understand how something like this could happen, how men who wore uniforms of power, of trust, could do something so cruel. Eventually, she forced herself to stand. Her hands trembled as she opened the car door and collapsed into the driver's seat. The engine hummed as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. As she gripped the wheel and started driving, her mind raced with question, with disbelief, with shame. How would she tell Eric? Would he even believe her? She didn't know. All she knew was that the town of Greenridge, the town she had trusted, had shown its true face. And it was ugly. Nina drove home that night in silence. The hum of the engine was the only sound in the car, but inside her head, the noise was deafening. Their voices still echoed, taunting, cold, cruel, mixing with the patter of the rain that seemed to fall harder now, as though the heavens were mourning with her. Her hands shook on the wheel. Her clothes were soaked, clinging to her skin, a chilling reminder of the horror she couldn't escape. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, the world outside a blur of shadows and wet pavement. She didn't even remember pulling into the driveway. When Nina stepped inside her home, it was dark and quiet. The familiar warmth she always found here felt different, foreign. She stood in the entryway for a moment, frozen, her mind replaying everything that had happened, every word, every touch. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the floor. She didn't cry, not yet. She couldn't. Hours later, Eric Martins came home. He found her in the bathroom. The water was running, steam filling the small space, but Nina was curled up on the shower floor, still in her wet clothes. Her arms hugged her knees tightly, her head resting against the cold tiles. The water streamed down her face, mixing with tears she couldn't stop. Eric stood in the doorway, stunned. He'd never seen her like this. His Nina, the strongest person he knew, now small and broken. He rushed to her side, switching off the water and pulling her gently out of the shower. "Nina," he whispered, wrapping a towel around her shaking body. "What happened?" She didn't answer at first. Her lips trembled as she tried to speak, but the words refused to come out. Eric helped her into a chair and knelt in front of her, his eyes filled with concern. "Talk to me," he urged softly. "What's wrong? Tell me what happened." Finally, Nina looked at him. Her voice was barely a whisper. "They were your men, Eric. Your men did this." Eric froze. Her words hit him like a sledgehammer. His hands, which had been holding hers, fell away. For a moment, he didn't move. He didn't breathe. He stared at her, searching her face, hoping, praying that he'd misheard her. "What?" His voice was low, rough. Nina's gaze dropped to the floor, her eyes empty. "They wore the uniforms. They pulled me over and..." Her voice broke. She couldn't finish. Eric stood abruptly, his fists clenched at his sides. His face turned pale, then red. His entire body shook with anger and disbelief. The woman he loved more than anything in this world, violated, broken by men who worked under him, men he trusted. Who were they? Eric's voice was hoarse, low, and dangerous. "I swear I'll find them. I'll end them." Nina looked up at him, her eyes hollow and tired. "I don't know their faces," she whispered. "But they were your men, Eric. Your men." Eric's heart shattered. His mind raced. He wanted to storm out of the house, to tear through the station, to drag every man in uniform into the dirt until he found out who was responsible. But beneath the fury, guilt began to fester, a sickening weight in his chest. These were his men. This was his police force, and somehow he hadn't seen it. Over the next few days, Eric Martins launched a quiet but relentless investigation. He told no one what had happened, not yet. Instead, he started by looking into his own officers. Who had been on patrol that night? Who had been assigned to that route? At the station, Eric's demeanor changed. The men under him noticed it, the tension in his shoulders, the sharp edge in his voice. He barked orders more than usual, and his eyes lingered on them longer than they should have. Unbeknownst to anyone, Eric began digging through old complaints and reports that had been buried under years of dust. What he found sickened him. There were other women who had filed reports that went nowhere, complaints about harassment, false arrests, and worse. Each time, the cases had quietly disappeared. Eric realized the truth then. This wasn't just about Nina. This had been happening for years, and no one had stopped it. In his office late one night, Eric sat at his desk, surrounded by files. His hands shook as he flipped through the pages. How could he have missed this? How deep did this go? He knew now that his police force wasn't just broken. It was rotten. And the men who had hurt his wife were part of something much larger, a system that thrived on silence, fear, and power. But Eric wasn't going to stay silent. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. Eric had narrowed it down to 2 men, Officers Greg Harmon and Tyler Quinn. They'd been on patrol the night Nina was stopped. Their logs were falsified, their whereabouts suspicious. Eric called them both into his office under the pretense of a routine meeting. He sat behind his desk, his expression unreadable, his fingers tapping slowly against the wooden surface. The 2 officers walked in, laughing and joking as though nothing was wrong. "Have a seat," Eric said coldly. The laughter stopped. The 2 men exchanged glances and sat down. Eric stared at them, silent for a long time, letting the tension hang heavy in the air. Finally, he spoke. "Where were you 2 on the night of October 14th? Greg shifted in his seat. Patrolling, sir. Same as always." Eric nodded slowly, his gaze locked on them. "You sure about that?" Tyler smirked, leaning back in his chair. "We followed the logs, sir. Is there a problem?" Eric stood up suddenly, slamming a folder onto the desk. The men flinched. Eric leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. "You know what you did? That woman you stopped? That was my wife." Greg's face went pale. Tyler's smirk faltered. Eric pulled out his phone and hit play. A recording began to play, a conversation between the 2 officers captured during his investigation. Their voices were unmistakable. The laughter, the arrogance. "She looked like just another nobody," one voice said. Eric stopped the recording and glared at them. "You still think she's nobody now?" Greg stammered. "Commissioner, I didn't." "Save it," Eric snapped. "You're done." The arrest happened that same evening. The 2 officers were dragged out of the station in handcuffs, their faces plastered with disbelief as the rest of the force watched in stunned silence. But karma wasn't finished with them yet. One of the men didn't last long in prison. Word got out about what they had done, and justice inside those walls was swift and brutal. The other lost everything. His family disowned him, his reputation destroyed. He would spend the rest of his life alone, haunted by his own actions. Meanwhile, Nina began to heal. Slowly but surely. She wasn't just the commissioner's wife anymore. She was a survivor, a voice for those who had been silenced. And Greenridge? It would never be the same. The men who thought they could escape justice were now living their own nightmares. And Nina? She found strength she never knew she had. Because karma doesn't care who you are. It strikes when it's deserved, and it never misses. The days that followed were quiet for Nina, but not empty. The house that once felt like a sanctuary had become something unfamiliar, and healing felt like climbing a mountain she had no strength for. Some mornings, she sat in the garden, staring at the flowers she once loved to tend, but now they seemed to wither under her gaze, like they too had lost something. But healing isn't a straight line. And slowly, piece by piece, Nina began to rebuild herself. It started with little things, walking through the garden barefoot again, letting the soil remind her of its steadiness. She found comfort in her students too, returning to the classroom sooner than anyone thought she would. For those kids, she smiled, even when smiling felt impossible. Eric, meanwhile, became a man on a mission. The files, the reports, the buried complaints, he brought them all to light. He didn't just arrest those 2 men. He tore open the foundation of corruption that had poisoned the Greenridge Police Department for years. He held meetings, fired officers who were complicit, and made it clear this was no longer a place for predators hiding behind badges. But it wasn't just about arrests and reforms. For Eric, this was personal. He vowed to clean up the force, not because he was the commissioner, but because he had failed to protect the person who mattered most to him. And Nina? She didn't hide her story. She stood in front of cameras, in town halls, and in classrooms, telling the truth. She became a voice for those who had been silenced, a light for those still living in darkness. No one else would have to go through what she did, not if she could help it. What happens when those in power betray our trust? When the very people who are supposed to protect us become the ones we fear most? The truth is, power can corrupt, systems can fail. But justice, true justice, doesn't rest. And sometimes it doesn't come from a courtroom. It comes from the strength of people who refuse to stay silent. Can justice heal the wounds left behind? Maybe not entirely. Some scars stay with us forever, but justice can stop those wounds from spreading to others, and that is worth fighting for. Because in the end, karma doesn't care who you are. It doesn't care about your title, your uniform, or your reputation. It strikes where it's due, and it strikes hard. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories every week. And now, it's your turn. Have you ever witnessed or experienced abuse of power? Or maybe you've heard a story that stayed with you? Share it in the comments below. Your voice matters, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.